Stop me if you've heard this one before. Left-wing cultural values are being forced down our throats. They're everywhere, and it isn't an accident, it's a strategy. All this modern progressivism, the subversion of traditional cultural values, is driven by a group of people with an agenda, with Marxist-derived theories about institutional inequality, identity politics, and trying to make everything politically correct. All these new diverse movies and shows, they're a reflection of this, and the endgame here is a play by leftist elites to weaken the fabric of Western civilization, make it easier to target straight white men by taking over key institutions, including the media and Hollywood. And this all trickles down into superhero movies, the forefront of today's cinematic pop culture, where we can see the agenda most clearly. Welcome back to the Superhero Diversity Problem, the series where we're chipping away topic by topic at the flawed way people talk about and understand diversity, representation, agendas, messaging, and all that within and beyond this little corner of pop culture. Now, that spiel just then, the one that opened the video, you probably thought I was talking about the woke agenda, right? That I was paraphrasing the general anti-woke grifters manifesto. Well, I wasn't. I was actually paraphrasing the central points of a conspiracy theory named cultural Marxism, a fringe, far-right theory from the 90s. Specifically, the idea was popularized by a bloke called Michael Minnicino, a follower of Lyndon LaRouche, whose beliefs included, among other things, that the Queen wanted to start World War III, so, you know, smart guys. As a fun little aside, it's also clearly inspired by the literal Nazi propaganda term cultural Bolshevism, a phrase widely used by state-sponsored critics in 30s Germany to denounce secularist, modernist, and progressive cultural movements. Sound familiar? Wait, sorry, did I say a fun little aside? I meant to say not fun. The thing is, though, I was talking about the woke agenda too, because, well, they're not exactly dissimilar. Indeed, if you look at some of the quote anti-woke pushback against minority-centric or merely minority-featuring media, particularly in so-called nerd culture, Star Wars, pop fantasy, and yep, superhero movies, you'll see it often adopts a lot of those same positions outlined above.
That is a demonstration that the ideological conquest of Marvel is complete.
They do not care about these characters, they care about their message.
The weird agenda they're pushing inside of these shows, TV shows, multiple companies, multiple studios.
Most of the people responsible for this type of discourse rarely get as specific as Minnicino did back in the day, but this idea of cultural Marxism is the template for this. The conviction that the relative increase in projects bearing in mind representation and inclusivity, or even projects which aren't overtly concerned with these things but deign to feature non-white people, non-hetero people, or even trans people in any non-peripheral way, is due to a concerted effort from a cabal of industry leftists for their own sinister ends. And the similarity isn't a coincidence. There is a direct causal link between the fringe conspiracy theory and the modern mainstream anti-SJW, anti-woke discourse, and shockingly, everyone's favourite lobster boy Blorben Bleeberson played a big role here. The disgraced ex-professor cited the rapid academic spread of cultural Marxism while protesting against the Canadian anti-discrimination bill, which shot him to online fame. This isn't to say that the online alt-right were clueless about this beforehand. Doubtless, a lot of these dopes had seen the idea themselves by this point, in whatever online space Jeterson did. But in terms of your average Joe hearing about the leftist plot to infiltrate institutions and brainwash via media, we can thank Meat Sweats over here for a lot of that. By the by, it ought to go without saying that the universities aren't being taken over by Marxist infiltrators, but it is probably worth making that point explicitly. As Matthew Sharp writes in an article for The Conversation, quantitative research bears out the idea that cultural Marxism is indeed a post-factual dog whistle, and an intellectual confusion masquerading as higher insight. But back to the domain of the terminally online. This newly widespread awareness of cultural Marxism combined with the remnants of the Gamergate movement, the ruins of Reddit edgelord atheist culture, and that baseline annoyance at PC culture gone mad to form modern reactionary culture. agenda, which then metastasized in the post-Last Jedi culture war to become the alt-right pipeline we know today. The point you should take away from this potted history, though, is that the roots of the so-called anti-woke movement trace fairly directly back to a fringe far-right conspiracy theory itself playing on fascist propaganda, swapping out one evil, hated, civilization-weakening group for another. None of this is to say that nobody working on these projects is making creative choices influenced by their personal progressive beliefs, whether that be writing a story that very consciously gives female characters agency, or pitching a Black Panther sequel that goes beyond who's gonna become the next cool bulletproof high-tech hero, and becomes a post-colonial piece about the way hegemonic dominance is upheld mentally, in how it forces other states to play their game on their terms, as well as simply militarily. Of course, on some level, creatives create in accordance with how they see the world, what future they'd like to see for it, but if this is an agenda, then everyone has an agenda. This video exists because of an agenda. The whiny comments below this video are an expression of their authors' agendas. Every act we take beyond basic self-preservation is due to our particular mindsets, our ideas of what we should be doing, and how we should do it. Maybe a piece of so-called woke media expresses a vision of the world, but if so, critiques of that piece do the same thing. It's bad because I think media should do this, not that. It's bad because my vision of the world is different, and so on. Everything is contingent. But anti-woke discourse, particularly in ideas like the woke mind virus, posits something beyond this, beyond a world full of individuals talking about and creating the things they want to. The central myth here, the load-bearing idea, is that they aren't making these choices, aren't writing these stories, aren't casting these actors for legitimate reasons, because they want to, because that particular choice was the best one they could make. It's because there's a plot. There's some level of coordination going on behind the scenes, and whenever you see a person of color on screen, they're not there organically, they've been forced in. I think we'll save this idea of forced diversity specifically for a future episode, but the phrase itself is telling here. The opposite of forced diversity would of course be unforced, natural homogeneity. That points us in an interesting direction. I think one major part of what's happening here is similar to what we discussed last time, with the CCA's impact on normalizing the Hays Code type waspy conservatism within comic book culture, that viewers are mistaking how it used to be, the level of diversity in the films they remember watching back in the day when they were younger, with a natural state of affairs, and that the increase they've noticed in the past few years isn't just the latest development in an ever-changing culture, but is instead a deviation from some pre-lapsarian past before the wokes got their hands on Hollywood. This is obviously nonsense. Even if we're thinking just about MCU discourse, the way Phase 1 and 2 are held up and idealized as non-woke, the reason we only saw white guys headlining the action for so long wasn't because that was some right or normal proportion, it was because of Marvel senior and noted ghoul person Ike Perlmutter's conviction that viewers didn't and couldn't care about female characters or people of color. It's nonsense, but it's an attractive type of nonsense, particularly for young white guys insecure about their place in the world. And it's a sort of gateway nonsense too. It's the basic logical flaw that makes people susceptible to the further, more outlandish parts of the anti-woke doctrine. I'd imagine by this point in the video, a lot of viewers who are on board the anti-woke train, or are at least sympathetic to critiques of wokeness, have already left comments complaining that I'm misrepresenting their movement, that when they're talking about wokeness, they mean something else. Like, some people would say She-Hulk's woke because of the female focus, and the, I guess, twerking post-credit scene that's simultaneously a 10-second long gag, and the harbinger of Western civilization's downfall, but maybe they'd say Black Panther isn't. Some would say both are. Some would say neither, but that episode of Young Justice where Khalid becomes Dr. Fate is, because it shoves his religion down your throat.
You should rely on God alone. I gave up magic when I converted to Islam.
Look, magic is a tool I'm using to do good. I mean, that's what our faith is all about.
Incidentally, you rarely hear that about Daredevil, do you? Nobody seems to mean exactly the same thing, but maybe that's the key to understanding it. I couldn't have satisfied all these people here, I couldn't have given one definition of wokeness, of anti-wokeness, of the woke mind virus and approached that specifically, because these things don't have definitions. They don't mean anything. Not anymore, not concretely. Of course, all linguistic meaning is socially constructed, and all of it changes over time. The verb improve, for instance, originally meant specifically agricultural improvement, but nowadays, when someone calls for a franchise, a film, or anything else to be improved, they're not recommending the implementation of the most up-to-date tillage practices. That isn't what I mean here, though. While woke started out meaning something, that is, roughly the state of being aware of social and systemic injustices, the word's foray into the mainstream was quickly followed by an ironic appropriation of the term. First by those wanting to mock corporate attempts to cash in on the new wave of social awareness, then by those wanting to mock the people getting woke sincerely, and the idea that any of their critiques were valid. After a few years, this ironic usage overtook any authentic usage, and then something funny happened. Following that whole online alt-right metastasis we discussed earlier, even that ironic usage phased out. People started using it euphemistically. When people use woke now, they're not talking about becoming aware of injustices. No, the word has become palimpsestic. It is used to refer to a great many things, from stuff interpreted as preachy, to media which platforms or even features minorities, to anything which deigns to critique any aspect of the neoliberal status quo, to any text short of outright conservative propaganda, and sometimes even that stuff's not safe. At this point, woke is essentially a floating signifier, a word which absorbs meaning, covers it up, rather than omitting it. It becomes a tangle of loosely related meanings, sometimes directly in line with that far-right theory of cultural Marxism, sometimes stopping short of actually saying that part out loud but gesturing in the direction. Sometimes it just means, why are people allowed to criticize me when I offend them? Sometimes what's implied by woke is contradictory. Take this image of wokeness as a sickness, the woke mind virus. This would seem to fly in the face of wokeness as agenda. After all, a mind virus inhibits agency, it's not an expression of it. Are these people weak, controlled by wokeness, or are they strong? Is wokeness the shape their control takes? This contradiction is, of course, utterly ignored by your anti-woke folks, who tend to use the mind virus idea interchangeably with the dastardly agenda idea. Why? Because the specifics aren't actually important, even to them. We'll come back to what I mean by that, but I would just like to point out explicitly that this contradiction, the weak wokes controlled by the virus versus the strong wokes controlling the media, that is just plainly a well-known fascist propaganda technique. Whichever outgroup a particular fascist movement wants to demonize at any given point is figured as utterly wretched weaklings, inferior to their pure betters, but also dangerous, also posing an urgent threat. Examples of this are plentiful. This strategy necessitates a sort of paternalist in-group rule, but justifies harshness to those who don't fit in, and needless to say, that pattern of thought has led to atrocities. So I'm not saying that everyone spouting this woke mind virus line is a fascist propagandist, but knowingly or otherwise, they are using fascist talking points. Anyway, yeah, the specifics aren't important. That's becoming increasingly obvious, because more and more anti-woke critiques have moved from criticizing things as woke to criticizing things because they're woke. There is a difference here. Take the whole Mary Sue thing. Initially, say around the release of The Force Awakens, the character of Rey was criticized for seeming to possess skills and knowledge that logically she shouldn't have. I don't want to get into that whole argument here, but rightly or wrongly, a flaw was perceived, and as a result of that flaw, the character, the film, was labeled by some as woke. The idea that the film was intentionally gesturing toward identity politics followed a critique of its internal logic. We can disagree with the argument. We can say some of those making that argument came into it biased, looking for flaws, but regardless, SJW woke was the explanation for the criticism, it wasn't the target of it. This doesn't tend to be how it goes these days. More and more, the opponents of the woke agenda criticize things because they are woke. Not because there's some flaw held to result from woke sensibilities. No, wokeness is the flaw. Things are criticized because they are woke. Some of these people know what they're doing, why they see it this way. They're under no illusions. They see and embrace the myth of cultural Marxism that was always there at the roots of the anti-woke movement. To varying degrees, they believe it, or at least, they believe in its persuasive, monetizable appeal, but their creation of woke as a floating signifier has allowed them to covertly spread the essence of this ludicrous ideology to the unsuspecting masses. Because around them, at the various preceding stages of the alt-right pipeline, there's a massive community united in the belief that wokeness is bad, that it's at once a dastardly plot and an unconscious sickness. None of them can prove that this agenda exists, that this actor was cast because of wokeness, or that story was written to push a radical feminist, man-hating message. None of them could explain in detail precisely what it is they believe to be happening, how it works, and why it's a problem. But they don't need to. It's the message. It's the agenda. If I'm one of these guys, I don't need a justification for why this is a problem, for what I actually think is going on. Woke erases my need for a justification. It absorbs that meaning. The presence in media of any ideas or messages I don't like, the acceptance and visibility of non-white, non-male, non-hetero, non-cis characters and stories is a problem for reasons I can't quite articulate, but I'm not racist or bigoted. Valid reasons exist. I can explain myself, I promise. Don't press me, I'll do it when I'm ready, but I don't have to if the next guy over's saying woke too. He knows. I don't know, not really. Not in any way that I can clearly verbalize beyond a bundle of buzzwords, but he knows that I know why, and I know that he knows why, so it's fine, so we can go on slinging mud at projects featuring minorities for valid reasons, I promise. And even when I do try to bring it back to the stuff that supposedly provoked these reactions, I'm not doing so in good faith. I know the stuff is woke, so I know it's bad, so I can review bomb it before it comes out, watch it solely to look for flaws and moments to cherry pick, and I'm justified in doing so because it's woke. And it's woke because the other guys around me, the ones who know what they're talking about, say it is. So She-Hulk hates men. It's woke. It must do. That's what woke things do. So let me skim through the episodes looking for incompetent or evil men. Young Justice is shoving gay characters down our throats, despite the fact that they and moments focusing on them are still wildly outnumbered by hetero equivalents. Wakanda Forever is anti-white, because after what, 20-something other films with majority white casts, this one has the audacity to center on non-white characters. Women too, at that, some of whom are extremely intelligent, and that doesn't fit because no one else in this world was extremely intelligent at their age, except for the characters that were. Even in arguments like this, even for people like this though, those details aren't flaws. Wokeness is the flaw. Things like the above are fine, obviously. There's nothing wrong in isolation with intelligent characters or a show centering on women or acknowledging gay people exist. Your anti-woke layperson knows this on some level, or at the very least, they know you can't just come out and say it. So these details are reconfigured as keys to the code, innocuous themselves but pointing to the wokeness hiding behind the projects, the secret evil within. But despite this, the wokeness can never be truly quantified. It slips from their grasp like gossamer when they try to prove, describe, define it without lapsing into bigotry. It's everywhere, but it disappears the moment you reach for it. Because here's the thing, wokeness doesn't exist in the text, or even in the secret underground SJW meeting rooms where Kathleen Kennedy, Kevin Feige, and Brie Larson convene to plot the next stages of the MCU. No, this euphemistic idea of wokeness, the leftist armies trying to persecute white men and build a femboy army through making background extras kiss in Disney films, the only place that exists is in the minds of the anti-woke critics. So next time they're telling you your brain is afflicted with some delusion-causing mind virus, take a second to appreciate the irony. I don't want to be too flippant about all this, though. It looks like we're living through another moral panic at the moment, and what do you know? The people being accused of, what is it now, grooming kids, are the same people who are getting the majority of the flack from this anti-woke movement in the name of defeating that nebulous, elusive agenda. I think it's naive to believe there isn't some link here, that these online reactionaries haven't played some part in laying the groundwork for this wider embrace of bigotry. So if you're being a twat to people online and you fight against the woke agenda, that thing which totally exists, which you can totally define, etc., etc., just remember, even if you've convinced yourself you're contributing to this climate of hatred for a reason, you're still contributing. Oh, and maybe do a little reflection to make sure that reason isn't directly inspired by neo-fascist propaganda. Anyway, that's that, the woke mind virus and so forth. Who knows when the next episode in this series will come? I sure don't. What I do know though is that I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters on screen now, especially Daniel Goldhorn and Ryan Emily for backing the channel and helping me keep the lights on. If you want to join up yourself, there's a link down below, there's a bunch of cool benefits, but otherwise, cheers for watching. Remember to disintegrate that like button, and I'll catch you all next time.
I'd love to say we're this super genius, drinker and Mahler and myself and everybody on Friday Night Tights, but it's just low-hanging fruit.